Verse number 3. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar, which is before the throne. And so here, Jimmy, we're going to kind of lump together verses 3 through 6 all together, but I want to pause for just a moment and just kind of take a picture here. Remember in Joshua, we just read in Joshua, that we had the Ark of the Covenant standing before them, and the priests are the one that had the ram's horns, the trumpets. And here we see a temple scene. The temple scene is, we have now these trumpets are given to the angels around the actual Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant is representative of God's throne. And now this is the real deal. So it's the same picture as Joshua 6, except for there's no symbolism. It's actually just the throne of God, 7 angels, 7 trumpets, same picture. And now we see another angel coming. He stood at the altar, verse 3, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it, that is the incense, with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar, which is before the throne. Interestingly, in verse 4, the smoke of the incense, which came up with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer, filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. There were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake, and the 7 angels which had 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Now this is where the half an hour comes in. So I'm gonna speculate here, and I don't think anybody could prove this, but I think it's a pretty decent idea. And that is that the half an hour of silence, which of course is broken here in verse number 5, we see these voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. The silence is broken here, but the half hour of silence is approximately the amount of time that it would take the high priest in the old covenant to perform an altar ceremony. So perhaps this is the same span of time that we see happening here. Either way, I won't push that point because there's no way that I could prove that. But it does seem like there's a poetic or a pregnant pause here where all of heaven is holding their breath, if you will, to be able to say that something significant is coming. And here we see exactly what that is. We see an incredible, boy, folks, you that are watching this video, you're ready to get blessed on this part. This is amazing. So we need to ask ourselves, what exactly is the golden altar of incense? And how is this working with the prayers of the saints? Well, remember, in the first century, as we're reading this, if we're the 7 churches, and we're starting to see civil war in Rome, we're seeing the civil war in Jerusalem, and many people at that point that didn't have the word of God or followers of Christ, they thought it was the end of the world. So here we see a fusion of Old Covenant and New Covenant. The fusion is we see this altar of incense that's going up to the Lord, but it's mixed with something. This time it's mixed with the prayers of the saints. We first have to wrap our mind around the idea of what exactly is this incense. Go to Revelation 5 and verse 8 first. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. You want to know how important your prayer life is to the Lord? Man, he loves us so very much. He's so interested in hearing your voice. Think about this. When he said to Adam, Adam, where are you? Remember in the garden? Adam, where'd you go? Now, did he know where Adam was? Well, certainly. But he wanted Adam to begin the conversation of the process of receiving his sentence, judgment, and ultimately healing. And so, Adam, where are you? God didn't write this book for his own benefit. He already knows all this. So why did he write it? Well, he wrote it for us to know who he is. This is a reciprocating relationship, and this is a very unique part of Christianity that separates us from almost every major religion in the world, is that our God knows us. He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. That's a very encouraging thing. And here in Revelation 8, what we're seeing is the altar of incense is going up, and it's mixed with the prayers of the saints as a sweet-smelling odor before the Lord. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into this and see if we can answer the question, what exactly is incense? Let's go ahead and look over in Psalm 141. In Psalm 141, that we would say the 141st Psalm, and verses 1 and 2. This is a psalm of David. He says, Lord, I cry unto thee, make haste unto me, give ear unto my voice when I cry unto thee. Let my prayer be set forth before thee as incense, and the lifting up of my heads as the evening sacrifice. Exodus chapter 30. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of the actual substance of incense. Exodus chapter 30, and we're going to look at verses 34 through 38. And it states, the Lord said unto Moses, take unto thee sweet spices, states, onyx, galbanum. These sweet spices with pure frankincense of each shall there be like weight. Thou shalt make it of a perfume, a confection after the art of apothecary, tempered together, pure and holy. And thou shalt beat some of it very small and put it before the testimony of the tabernacle of the congregation, where I will meet with thee, and it shall be given unto you most holy, as for perfume which thou shalt make. You shall not make to yourselves according to the composition thereof. It shall be unto thee holy for the Lord, and whatsoever shall make like unto that, to smell thereto, shall even be cut off from his people. We're seeing the instructions given for how to make the smelling part of this incense. But there's one more mixture that we need to mix this thing with, and that is we need to mix it with the oil. There's oil is created by pressing an olive. If you press an olive, you get this oil, and you're mixing this oil in with this perfumed incense, and that's what we're going to burn before the Lord, so that the smell is burned up from the olive oil and the incense up to the Lord. What is all of this telling us? Let's go to Matthew chapter 26, and Jesus is going to tell us the point of all this when we get to this famous story about the alabaster box. Remember the woman who goes before the Lord and begins to worship him with the alabaster box?
Yeah.
Let's read that again in chapter 26 of Matthew in verses 6 through 13. It'll all make sense to us. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box. Let's pause for a moment. What is an alabaster box? Well, it's a box made of very, very expensive rock-like substance, a sediment that was carved out to hold a very precious ointment. So she has an alabaster box in verse 7, a very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat. But when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, to what purpose is this? Look at this word, Jimmy. Waste. For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. So the disciples come by and they're like, whoa, whoa. Why are you wasting this ointment? What a waste.
I got a feeling that might have been Judas mostly.
Yeah, and they have such a righteous pretension, right? I mean, they're saying,
Right.
we could sell this and give it to the poor. You know, one of the things, Jimmy, that I have noticed in doing Bible study, especially public Bible study like this, is I'll notice that those that are not, I'm a very principled person, at least that's how I try to live my life. If something is right, I want to do it, even if it doesn't make sense. If it says it in the Word of God, you just do it. This is one of those times where Jesus is making a bigger point than the immediate context. The disciples saw the immediate context and said, why are you wasting this? We could take that exact same thing, sell it, and give it to the poor. She's wasting this. Now look what Jesus says to them in verse 10. When Jesus understood it, he said unto them, why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. Verse 12 explains it. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her. She was mixing this ointment onto his body. But Jimmy, what ingredient are we missing for the incense? We're still missing this oil. Now, Christ was broken for us. We know that. Let's go ahead and look at Luke chapter 22 and verse 19. And he took bread and gave thanks and brake it and said unto them, this is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. His body was broken for us. Well, remember the story of fruit in the whole Bible. God wanted to show how great he was, so he created somebody in his own image. He's an image bearer. And as Adam is the image bearer of God in the garden, he wanted Adam to create things just as he creates things. He wants Adam to be a representative of who he is. So he puts him in a garden. A garden is reproductive. It's something coming after it. So if you read Revelation 1, you'll see that God creates this herb yielding seed, and it produces after its kind. Everything is after its kind. The tree is after its kind. Everything's after its own kind in a very specific, organized way. And so fruit bearing is a way of showing a production of how the Creator wants us to be like him. So when we produce fruit, we are drawing attention to his creative works. And so fruit bearing is the whole thing. Okay, fine. Adam, you failed. Okay, I'm going to take one guy over here. No, I'm going to set you apart. And through you, I'm going to bring the nation of Israel in Genesis chapter 12. And Abraham, I'm going to use you and this people group you're going to be like a vineyard for me. I'm going to hedge of protection about you. And I want you to produce this fruit for me. In other words, be with me in a relationship and produce good works for me. Why are you producing sour grapes? Why wild grapes and olives? I don't understand. I've given you all these things and you still will not obey me. And as I'm trying to receive fruit from you and I'm trying to receive these good things from you, I'm just receiving sour grapes and wild olives. What more do I have to do? Right? All I want is for you to obey me and to produce good fruit. So this fruit theme is going in this text. And so he says, I'll tell you what, Jimmy, this will be a blessing for those that are paying attention and watching this. He says, you know what, I think I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to become the fruit for the world. I'm going to crawl down into the winepress of my own wrath. I'm going to press my own body. And out of my body will produce the best wine you've ever imagined in your entire life. It will be so satisfying. It'll be like a river of living water. So Jesus has now been put into the press. And out comes this oil, this olive oil, this wine. And so when the woman with the alabaster box starts adding the other ingredients from the Old Testament, she's creating this incense as God has poured out for us. So all of these imageries start coming together as the oil is the Holy Spirit. Let's look at Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. It all comes together here as we go a little further. This is an interesting parable that Jesus gives. Let's read together. And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. This is Luke 18, now verse 2. Saying, there was in a city a judge, which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. Verse 4, and he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubled me, I will avenge her, lest by her continually coming she weary me. Now let's pause for a moment and kind of recap what Jesus is saying. Jesus is trying to get across the point that he is in charge of this covenant lawsuit coming on Israel. And he is saying to his disciples, he's trying to teach them this lesson. He says, let's imagine for a moment that we have a judge, okay? He's not a godly judge. He doesn't regard the Lord in his life. He doesn't care about godly things. He's totally selfish. In fact, he doesn't even care what people think. This judge is just completely self-sufficient, self-centered. But there comes a woman before him that has an actual case, and she needs help with it. She came before this judge who doesn't care about God or people, and she came before him, and she bothered him. She came one day, and came the next day, and came the next day, and came the next day with a grievance that she had. And Jesus is just simply saying here now, and he reiterates this again in verse number 4, I believe. He said, once again, this guy doesn't care about God. He doesn't regard God nor about man. But the woman began to bother him. She was taking up his day. Because remember, he's self-sufficient, he's self-centered. And so in verse number 5, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. I don't want this to continue. She's bugging me. Verse number 6, and the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him? Sounds like the fifth seal, doesn't it, Jimmy?
Mm-hmm.
Though he bear long with them. Now listen to this, folks. Jesus says, I tell you that he, that's God, will avenge them, how long? Speedily. Nevertheless, when's this going to happen? Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? Jesus is saying, okay, I can reason with your human intellect. There's a judge who doesn't care about what people think, doesn't care about what God thinks, but he's annoyed by this lady, and he eventually does what's good by her just so she leaves him alone. Now, let's replace that ungodly judge with God himself, and the woman is going to be those in covenant with God, and they are crying. And God and Jesus is just making the point, if an ungodly judge would act even in a selfish way to just get the woman to stop bothering him, how much more am I going to act on your behalf? Yes, I will avenge you. And you know when that's going to happen? Speedily. Speedily is when it's going to happen. When the Son of Man comes, here's the question. Here's the question when the Son of Man comes, Jimmy. We're going to keep going back to this. What's the question when the Son of Man comes? How many are going to be over here? Oh, there's going to be plenty over here. Who's going to be here? Will he find faith on the earth? I don't know. You got to shoulder that decision, man. Your shoulders are between these two. And by the way, this is the same decision everybody that's listening to this has to make too. You're going to shoulder that decision. You're going to curse God. You're going to follow the advice of Job's wife, or are you going to be over here squarely and securely saying, Lord, I believe in your Son. I believe in his teachings. I'm securely found in the blessings coming through Jesus Christ. That's what we're seeing in this. Let's look at verses 3 through 6 one more time in Revelation. Let's make some more connections here. It says in verse number 4, and the smoke of the incense, which came up with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. The angel took the censer, filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. Now here breaks our silence. There were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And 7 angels, which had the 7 trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. So a couple things just to notice here. You have in this time period that Jesus referred to as the birth pains. We see these things happening from the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24. We see the famines and the earthquakes and perilous times that are coming, and pestilence and family turning against family and nations against nation. We see all these things happening, and there would be a temptation for these 7 churches to say this is the end of the world. And Revelation 8 is just simply saying it's not the end. In fact, you want to know what's going on here is your prayers that you're praying are mixed with the oil of the Holy Spirit, and you are like now the new version of the temple. Your prayers are immediately ascending to the throne and coming before the throne, and it's a worship service. I know things are scary down here, but it's a worship service up in heaven. And so we also see that the same angel that's doing this task we see here in verse number 5 is the angel took the censer, filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. Jesus said, when you pray, pray this way, right? And what part of that prayer that he said is that your will be done in heaven as it is in earth. Remember the Jacob's ladder connection. The point of Jesus coming was to be a connectivity between the 2 realms of the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. And we see after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, as he is now the representative of mankind, our representative in the heavenly realm, we see a connection happening between heaven and earth. Now, the worship service that's going on in heaven has a result on earth as well. The same angel that went to that same altar of incense to worship God now took fire off of that purging altar and is now pouring some of it on the earth. And now we see the silence broken, and we're getting into the 7 angels now line up with their trumpets, just like we saw in Joshua, and they're going to start blowing these trumpets one at a time, and these are called the trumpet judgments. And we're going to see the city fall. This first century version of the pagan Canaanite city Jericho, Israel has become the same version of that, and it is now going to fall as God is drawing us back to all of these covenantal principles that we've been reading about the whole time in the Old Testament.
That's amazing.
Let's go ahead and go to verse number 7. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees were burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. So we're going to kind of have verse number 7 as kind of a standalone, because we have 2 references or 2 hyperlinks back to our grocery store aisle, and it's trying to get us to understand something. And basically all we're going to understand is that the Lord is doing the same thing to Israel as he did to Egypt. And so we're going to see a recapitulation or a replaying out of a very familiar story. The first thing we're going to go to is, let's go to Exodus chapter 9, where we see the same triad here of hail, fire, and blood in Exodus chapter 9. Exodus chapter 9 and verses 23 and 24 say this: And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire ran upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. So once again, this wording is very specific and very important for us to recognize that we're saying God is communicating here that Israel has become the new Egypt. It's become the new bondage of sin. And by the way, read Galatians 3 and 4. That's Paul's entire point of teaching through the new covenant, that you can be in physical Jerusalem, which is likened onto Hagar and Ishmael, the child of bondage, the servant child, or you can be part of the new Jerusalem, which is a heavenly Jerusalem, a new city that's likened unto Sarah and Isaac, the child of promise. This is consistent. I was just sharing with somebody recently when they were asking me a Bible question. I said, if your Bible teacher goes to half a verse or one verse and it's their answer for everything, that's a huge red flag. If you're teaching the whole counsel of God, you should be able to go to almost any book you want, any chapter, and your message is consistent. Man, be very, very careful or cautious, just huge red flag, when people use what I call bullet point theology. They talk about the same verses over and over again, and it's the same terminology, it's the same phrases, and they're making the exact same points from the same half a verse because that's their hobby horse, and they don't see the whole counsel of God. I would say, when you're looking at this majestic forest of theology, they have zoomed up on one tree and they're inspecting the bark on that one part of that one tree, and that's all they can see, and they're missing the whole point of everything. So just be careful of that, because the message that we're going through in Revelation 8, as you can see, we're in Exodus, we're in Deuteronomy, we're in Joshua, we're going to be in Jeremiah. I mean, this is all talking about the same story. So just be very careful of that.
Well, hey, man, he who's without sin cast the first stone.
That's right. Yeah, never heard that before. So, or I probably hear this 3 or 4 times a day, that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It took me forever to even know why people were quoting that to me. And it finally dawned on me they were trying to say that you can't talk about a new covenant because he doesn't change.
Yeah.
That's ripping it wildly out of context.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, somebody taught them to say that. Like that, you and I see comments all the time where people put just a Bible verse. Well, folks, we believe every part of the Bible. What we disagree in is the interpretation of it.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about having belief in God and you spam us with comments that say, no, you have to follow the commandments of God, our difference is not that you found that verse and we had not considered that verse. The difference is interpretation of the verse. So it would be helpful if you disagree with us and you want to put a comment or a verse. It'd be helpful if you articulate what you mean by using that verse with the video that we've just made.
Yeah, those videos.
I don't understand that.
Those verses that were used on our last episode in the comments we've actually done a whole episode on those verses.
Yeah, I know. I feel like folks that are doing that, and you've said it before, they're not watching the videos. I think
Right.
they just see our faces and just say, "Yeah, you guys are wrong because we're to follow God's commandments." Like we haven't thought about or something. It's
Right.
kind of interesting.
Right.
Ezekiel. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 5. Ezekiel chapter 5. So I hope by now, if you're following along, you're seeing these hyperlinks all over the place. These are very powerful connections with the rest of the Bible. And Ezekiel chapter 5. Ezekiel's just an awesome book. I enjoy Ezekiel. Ezekiel 5 in verses 1 and 2 says this, "And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp knife, take thee a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon thine head and upon thy beard. Then take thee balances to weigh and divide the hair. Thou shalt burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city. When the days of the siege are fulfilled, thou shalt take a third part and smite it with a knife. The third part thou shalt scatter in the wind, and will draw out a sword after them." Again, in verse number 12 says this, "A third part of thee shall die with a pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee. And a third part shall fall by the sword round about thee, and I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and will draw out a sword after them." A third part this, a third part that is a very common way in the Old Covenant that God is using covenantal language in his judgment on ungodliness by saying it's not a total destruction, it's a partial destruction of something. And so here we're drawing back that same idea because we're going through we're going through trumpet judgments 1 through 4 in chapter 8. And we're going to see towards the end, we get into chapter 9, that the last 3, the angel will announce, "Woe, woe, woe to them that are the inhabitants of the earth." So another way you can understand it is the first 4 trumpet judgments are a judgment on the earth themselves. These are the leading up to the actual final destruction of Jerusalem. And we see here, this is a destruction on the earth, but the last 3 of the trumpet judgments are going to be geared towards the inhabitants of the earth. Now, the first 4 are certainly going to affect you. I mean, if I came and I destroyed a third of all your crops and a third of this, you're going to start feeling it. These are like the birth pains Christ was talking about. Prices go up, inflation goes up, people are hungry. And also notice things are connected here in verse number 7. Notice that we see the first angel sounding. There followed hail, fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees was burnt up, and green grass was burnt up. So we see trees and grass are connected together because if I started a fire in somebody's backyard, you're going to see both trees and grass. In other words, these are like things that are one naturally would and logically affect another. If I if I was able to destroy a lot of oil, let's just say in modern terminology, if I destroyed a lot of petroleum, the cost of gas would go up because there would be less of it. It would become a more valuable commodity. If there's an increase in production of oil, then gas goes down because we can have a free system to where people can say, well, I can now undercut you because I'm getting it for cheaper and so forth, and prices go down. Here we see that things that are connected like that, logical connections, grass and trees are being burned up together with this first trumpet, and we're starting to feel the squeeze of difficult times coming. And this is what we see when Jesus was talking about it in Matthew chapter 24.
If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and check out the full episode by clicking the link below.